This is lecture 1B for History 111 at Northern College for August 31st, 2020. So last time I talked about the evolution of human beings and their emergence and how they spread around the world by 40,000 or at least 25,000 BC. Now I want to talk about the big transformation that happened in human history. And this is probably the biggest revolution that ever happened in human history, and that is the Neolithic Revolution. And essentially, the Neolithic Revolution is a reference to a whole series of innovations that happened and came together between 8,000 and 3,000 BC in various places. Okay, and it's sort of got an internal logic. I'll talk about it later. But essentially, there were a number of things that human beings were doing, sorts of inventions, but then it all came together between 8,000 and 3,000 BC. In a whole series of new inventions in all sorts of different places. Right? Now, the Neolithic Revolution really happened first in Africa and Eurasia, Europe, China, Africa, etc. And I'll talk about that. It happened much later in Australia and the Americas. So at the core of the Neolithic Revolution is this question of new inventions, right? And the basic one is agriculture, which is the domestication of plants. And by domestication of plants, I'll talk about this a little bit in the discussion section for this lecture. But the domestication of plants involves taking plants that are wild plants and then breeding them essentially to be more productive of what you want. Maybe bigger seeds, maybe more seeds, maybe faster seeds, bigger fruit, whatever. And then. And this domestication, so it's a genetic modification of plants, okay, for human use. There's also, the second big invention is animal domestication, right? That basically we began to breed a series of animals to be better suited to us, right? And there's a whole bunch of changes that happen when animals get domesticated. They basically get dumber, usually, although dogs have apparently gotten smarter. But they tend to be less aggressive. They tend to be bigger, and there's a bunch of other changes. But basically, what human beings are doing is getting animals to live with human beings, either through captivity or being used to them, and then breeding them selectively to try and create better animals, okay, for human use. Those two things were crucial for the Neolithic Revolution because that really gives you the possibility of a sedentary agricultural society. Second, you saw advanced stone tools, polished tools and ground tools. So you can do much more precise tools and much better tools out of stone if you're doing polishing and grinding than if you're just chipping them. And so the quality of tools gets significantly better, right? And then another huge leap is metal smelting, right? Copper and iron, iron comes later, but copper smelting in particular becomes a really crucial way for human beings to start to make new tools out of metal rather than stone, but you need smelting technologies, which is when you take ore and you basically apply high heat to it in order to get the metal to melt out of the ore, and then you get rid of the slag, and you keep the purified metal, and you work with that. Another big thing is pottery, right? The discovery that you could bake clay and make it hard and permanently take a shape allowed for the creation of pots, it allowed for the creation of jugs, it allowed for the creation of plates and cups and things like that. And this allows for food storage, right, which is a huge advance, right? Another big issue, a big development in the Neolithic Revolution is the development of cities, okay? And then finally, the development of writing. And I'll talk about cities and writing in later discussions. But for right now, these are the basic inventions that all come together in the Neolithic Revolution. And in many ways, these inventions, this process is not a, it's not a, like everything just happened at once. Instead, it's a kind of a process where one thing leads to another. For instance, when you start to do domesticated plants, at first, human beings would simply, they might plant plants and then go away and come back when they knew they were going to be ready. But then, of course, maybe the plants get choked by weeds, maybe they get eaten by animals, and so humans start doing, more things to gradually become invested in the plants. But that tends to make them a little bit sedentary. Animal domestication, on the other hand, tends to make human beings move with the animals. But once you have these things, you have more food, right? Agriculture can produce more food, and animal domestication can produce more food. Well, that requires food storage, and so the invention of pottery sort of follows from that. And once you've got a lot of food, the population starts to grow, right? And when the population grows, then you start getting cities, you start getting specialization, you start getting social classes, you start getting wealth that you can pass on to future generations, and metal smelting leads to all sorts of generation forms of wealth, etc. And then once you've got cities, you need complicated governments, you need writing to keep track of everything. So it's not like everything just sort of happened. It's that as they moved into this Neolithic revolution, one thing seemed to require the invention of other things, right? And so it's a long, sort of slow process whereby human beings make this one big leap to domesticating plants and animals, but that leap requires a whole bunch of other adjustments that lead to the invention of polished stone tools, metal smelting, pottery, cities, governments, writing, etc. Right? So that's essentially the Neolithic revolution in a nutshell, is that human beings made this enormous leap to domesticate plants and animals, and then that led to the creation of cities, metal smelting, pottery, writing, etc. All right. Now, the Neolithic Revolution, we call it the Neolithic Revolution, but it wasn't one revolution. It was multiple revolutions. It was lots of revolutions, right? Because it happened over and over again in lots of different places. Anywhere people figured out how to domesticate plants and animals would lead to a Neolithic Revolution that tended to include all this other stuff, right? And so the oldest place that we have for the Neolithic Revolution, and I'm going to talk in the discussion about when places, what the chronology is more closely, but basically the oldest place that we have for the Neolithic Revolution is the Fertile Crescent, which is basically the modern-day Middle East. Think Mesopotamia, Iraq, modern-day country of Iraq, and then up into southeastern Turkey, and then down through modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Israel, right? And it's a crescent shape, what I just described there. And so that was probably about between 9,000 and 8,500 BCE. Now I want to point something out here. I'm using BCE now. I was using years ago in the previous lecture because I was talking about millions of years ago that humans evolved. This I'm using BCE, which means before the Common Era. And that generally is the same as BC, meaning before Christ, but that's a specifically Christian time frame. So historians generally use before Common Era so as not to center Christianity in history, because most of the people in human history are not Christians. So the Fertile Crescent might have been as early as 9,000 BCE, so they're right at the front edge of the Neolithic Revolution, but certainly about 8,500 or so. China was pretty soon after that. And it probably emerged first in southern China around the Yangtze Valley. A separate form of agriculture developed in northern China because the climate was very different in northern China, right, on the Yellow River Valley. And so China was probably about 7,500 to 6,500 BCE. On the island of New Guinea, agriculture emerged independently. Probably around 7,000 BC, they domesticated the first plants. Right? The African Sahel. Now, this is something most people don't know where it is. If you think about Africa in the largest sense, and if I had a marker, if you think about Africa, I'm just going to draw a very small Africa over here. If Africa is shaped like this, the Sahara Desert is up here. So this is mostly desert. The Sahel is this area right along the southern edge of the desert, which is open grasslands, and it has enough rain, etc., for agriculture. So it's really just right along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, and that's the African Sahel. And in the African Sahel, we see the first examples of agriculture emerging about 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. And all these dates are rough estimates. We really don't have exact dating. We're just guessing, right? Okay. And then tropical West Africa, which is actually down here a little ways, when you get along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert is open grasslands and it's fairly dry. But then when you get farther south and into the tropics, now you have very wet, very hot conditions, and that was going to require a totally different set of crops. There's going to be a totally different set of animals, and so agriculture and animal domestication emerge in tropical West Africa differently, separately than in the African Sahel. And so tropical West Africa is probably about 6,000 BCE. And then Ethiopia, we have various amounts of evidence that in Ethiopia, which is in East Africa over here, that in Ethiopia, agriculture emerged. They domesticated some plants, but we're not sure if that led to the whole Neolithic Revolution. It looks like they started to domesticate plants and things, but then they borrowed plants from the African Sahel, and then it developed in the Neolithic Revolution. But basically, it's not quite clear whether they invented it all on their own or whether they borrowed some of it from the African Sahel, or the Fertile Crescent, rather. Sorry. Mesoamerica, which is to say southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, etc. The Neolithic Revolution happened about 4,000 to 3,500 BCE. And then in the Andes and Amazonia, which is, say, modern-day Peru, and then western Brazil, and Ecuador, around that area, the Neolithic Revolution happened about 3,500 BCE. And then finally, there's evidence that in the eastern United States, which is to say the Ohio River Valley, agriculture emerged later still, which is, say, about 2,500 BCE. So you see there's a pretty big spread there from about 9,000 BCE to 2,500 BCE is emerging in various places. And part of the reason we know that these are all different is that they develop agriculture with different plants and different animals, right? And so clearly they developed that on their own. So there are origins all over the place. Now, there are lots of places where you hear about agriculture and some of the early civilizations, which I haven't mentioned so far, right? Egypt, or ancient Greece, or etc. The Indus River Valley in modern-day Pakistan. Those are places where early agriculture from the Fertile Crescent, or from other spots of origin, spread, right? And so, for instance, the Fertile Crescent, the modern-day Middle East, which is Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, in that area, agriculture was invented, but then it spreads up through Turkey, and then up into Greece, and the Balkans, and then up into Europe, right? And then we can also talk about agriculture spreading from China across Southeast Asia, etc. And for instance, the Fertile Crescent also, it seems like agriculture spread from there over across southern Iran and into Pakistan, and the Indus River Valley became one of the early civilizations with borrowed agriculture. And the reason we say it's borrowed is because they have the same crops, right? And so if it shows up first in the Fertile Crescent, and then the same crops show up in the Indus River Valley, they borrowed it, right? So essentially, we have agriculture beginning in a whole bunch of places, and then as agriculture begins, it sets in motion this process which leads to other inventions and innovations, and that transforms society. And it really is a transformation, because think about the difference between being in a hunting-gathering society. You have very few physical possessions. You have very little technology. You've got some, stone knives, and you might have some woven, animal skins, some woven textiles, maybe. But you're basically moving around all the time in small groups. And now in the Neolithic Revolution, now you've got settled agriculture, which is much bigger density, greater density per square mile, like 5 to 10 times as many people per square mile. You've got, and all that food creates a greater birth rate, which means the populations grow faster. You've got enough population density. You've got cities now. You've got all these new technologies like pottery and writing and metal smelting and all the stuff you can make out of metal. But most of all, people are sedentary, right? They're staying in the one spot. They're making that one spot produce all the food they need. They're not moving around, right? So this is a massive shift in human history. And really, this is the beginning of history as the discipline, the history department. This is really where we start, because this is when you have sedentary human civilizations and societies with written records and things like that allow you to now study history as opposed to studying archaeology. Right? Now, there's some interesting questions about. One is, when you're talking about the spread, right? I mean, so agriculture starts in the Fertile Crescent, and it moves up into modern-day Turkey and then into modern-day Greece and the Balkans, etc. What's actually happening there, right? Because there's two basic ways that could happen. One is a bunch of people in the Fertile Crescent start to do agriculture, and then some people nearby who are hunters and gatherers go, hey, look at that. That looks like a good thing. I want to try that. And they copy it, right? And they say, hey, can we borrow some of your seeds? Can you show us how to plant it? Or they basically innovate themselves. They say, well, those guys are doing this, I'm going to try that, right? So it could spread by copying, right? Or it could also spread by expansion. And by what I mean there is, suppose you have the Fertile Crescent and a bunch of people settle down and start doing agriculture, and that starts to produce much more population, right? The population rate goes up dramatically. And we know, for instance, that in hunting and gathering societies, the average adult woman has a child about every 2.5 years, whereas in an agricultural society, the average adult woman in agricultural societies of this time period probably had averaged about a child every year. So it's like 2.5 times as many kids, right? And so what could happen then is that, suppose the Fertile Crescent, they settle down, they start doing agriculture, and the population starts growing. Well, pretty soon they have too many people for the land. And so they start to push up into Anatolia, and they start to cut down forests or whatever and make it into farmland. And that pushes the hunters and gatherers out, right? Because the people in agricultural societies always have more numbers than people in hunting and gathering societies, and so they can push them out. Right? So that's a different form of expansion. It's not that the hunters and gatherers are adopting agriculture, it's that the agriculturalists are expanding and sort of conquering more territory because agriculture gives them an advantage. Now, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be a little bit of both. Maybe they start to push hunters and gatherers out, and then the hunters and gatherers in desperation adopt agriculture. But there's definitely two different dynamics that could be happening there. But in a larger sense, there's, and I've sort of answered it already, but in a larger sense, there is a really profound question, which is, why would anybody go to agriculture? Right? Now, from our perspective, we're like, well, that's obvious. This is the beginning of civilization, right? This leads to us putting men on the moon and the internet, right? We can't have Netflix without the Neolithic Revolution. But in another sense, it's really not a great choice. Because historians have really looked closely, and archaeologists have looked closely at the bodies of people from the Neolithic Revolution preserved in graves and things. And they've looked very closely at the lifestyle and the food they were eating. And essentially, the agricultural revolution is a bit of a trap. Because if you look at a hunting and gathering society, people probably, it varies from place to place and time of the year, etc., but people in hunting and gathering societies probably spent about 4 hours a day working on food, which leaves them about 12 hours a day of waking hours to do other stuff, right? People in agricultural societies are doing more like 10 to 12 hours a day of working on food, right? Agriculture is much more labor intensive than hunting and gathering, right? And in addition, if you look at the teeth of people from hunting and gathering societies and people from early agricultural societies, people in early agricultural societies are basically eating a whole lot of grain. And that is high in sugars, and their teeth rot, and they're actually kind of malnourished. If you look at the growth patterns in their bones and things, they're malnourished. So agriculture requires like 2.5 times as much work every day, and you don't get as good a diet out of it. Why would you adopt that? Right? Why would you go there? Well, the first answer is that they didn't know they were going there, right? Maybe it seemed like a good idea to settle down and just grow one crop, and then it sort of got away from them before they knew what happened. They had forgotten how to be hunters and gatherers. They'd spent 5 generations trying to be agricultural laborers, and they don't know how to go back. Right? That's possible. But there are other answers, too. One is that it's quite possible that people were forced to turn to agriculture because hunting and gathering became less feasible. And the reason for that might be climate change or overhunting, population, etc. That basically, suppose you have a hunting gathering society that's doing pretty well, and the population starts to grow, right? And now normally when a hunting gathering society, the population grows, a group of people break off and go somewhere else. But suppose the human population has grown enough so that there's really nowhere else to go without bumping into other hunting and gathering groups. So now what do? Well, out of desperation, you start to experiment with trying to get the food, more food to grow where you are. So maybe you figure out that when you dig up a yam and you eat half of it, if you stick it back in the ground, it grows again and there's more yams. So you start doing that, right? And maybe you start to realize that if you pull these plants out, these weeds out, then the food you like grows better, right? So they start doing that, and basically it's because of the pressure of increased population that they start to do innovations that lead to agriculture, right? So they were forced into it. Another option is climate change, right? That we know that human beings lived through several ice ages, and it's entirely possible that climate change shifted things so that maybe hunters and gatherers had a great way of living right here, but then the temperature starts getting colder in an ice age or warmer, and people start finding that the plants that they depended on were not growing the way they used to, right? And in particular, there's some evidence that the last ice age ended about 15,000 years ago, right? And so remember, we're talking to innovations here, 9,000 to 3,000. About 12,900 to 11,600 years ago. Okay, so the ice age ends 15,000 years ago, and temperatures start getting warmer, right? They're getting warmer. But then about 12,900 to 11,600, it starts to go down again, right? It starts to get colder again. And it's possible that the human population of hunters and gatherers grew dramatically as the temperature got warmer, but then it starts getting colder, and suddenly they have too many people, and they have to start innovating in order to survive, right? And there's some evidence. There's some more complicated story there. I'll talk about it in a later discussion. But it's entirely possible then that human beings adopted agriculture not because they wanted to, and certainly not because they knew where it was going. It doesn't look like they were like, a bunch of hunters and gatherers are like, hey, let's start domesticating plants, and then we'll domesticate animals, and then we'll settle down to sedentary agriculture, and we'll invent something called pottery, and we'll invent cities. And they didn't do that. They were feeling their way forward and reacting to their environment. They were probably doing it under pressure. Right? They were probably doing it under either population pressures or the pressures of climate change or species extinction. That if there's enough people in a particular area, they start to drive the animals they eat extinct, or they start to eat all the plants, and then they have to start innovating there too. So there's a number of ways that the Neolithic Revolution could have been not a voluntary choice. Right? In fact, it was almost certainly a forced choice. And this sets the human race on an entirely different trajectory, right? To go from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture leads to all these innovations, but it also leads to, just a dramatically different form of existence for human beings.